They said I was outdated, that my dishes were a shameful relic, and taste mattered more than tradition. I was pushed out of the family dinner like a piece of kitchen furniture, but I didn't argue. I simply smiled. And on Thanksgiving, when they opened the delivery and read the note from the chef, with my name and my recipe, the room fell silent, uncomfortably so, because on the box was my face and the phrase they always mocked, "Food is respect." If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Marilyn Joyce. I was 68 when I left my small brick house in Trenton, New Jersey, to move closer to my only son, Matthew, in the suburbs of Boston. For 37 years, I had taught culinary arts at a local community college. I wasn't famous, but within my circles, teachers, caterers, local chefs, I was known for two things: my insistence on cooking from scratch and my belief that every dish carries a story. Retirement didn't come easily for me. I wasn't tired of teaching, but the school downsized, and they said my position was being phased out. It felt more like being gently erased. Matthew had been asking me for over a year to come live near them. He said it made sense now that I was on a fixed income and lived alone after my husband's passing. "We'll be closer, Mom. You can be part of the kids' lives," he had said. There was no pressure in his tone, not exactly, just the steady drip of guilt, like a leaky faucet I couldn't fix. Eventually, I said yes. I sold my house, packed up my kitchen tools, kept the ones I loved most, and moved into the small in-law suite attached to their home. It wasn't a bad space. I had my own entrance, a compact kitchenette, a bedroom, and a bathroom, but it was clear from the first day that the invitation had come with conditions, subtle ones, unspoken, but present in every look and pause. The kids barely looked up when I arrived. My daughter-in-law, Sandra, hugged me with her arms, but not her eyes. Her smile had the smooth efficiency of someone posing for a photo. In my first week there, I offered to help make dinner. Just something small, a way to contribute. I knew their lives were busy. Sandra worked remotely in marketing, and Matthew often got home late. But when I reached for the kitchen towel one evening and asked where they kept their spices, Sandra gently took the towel from me and said, "Oh no need, really. We have a system." She didn't look at me when she said it. Her voice was calm and pleasant, but her hands moved quickly, like I was in the way. I retreated back into my suite that night and sat down at the tiny breakfast table near the window. Outside, a maple tree flickered with late October light. I could see children riding scooters in the cul-de-sac. None of them were mine. I'd imagined something different, maybe setting the table together, sharing recipes, laughing over flour on noses like in old TV commercials. But this wasn't a commercial. This was a quiet arrangement, and I was the extra piece that didn't fit. Each morning, I rose early and made coffee, not for anyone else, just for me. I tried to bake once, early on, my signature lemon tea bread, the kind my students had always begged for around finals. The smell filled my suite and crept into the hallway. Sandra knocked on my door with a tight smile and asked if I could avoid baking during her meetings. "The smell's a little distracting," she said. I nodded. I wrapped the rest of the loaf and left it on the porch bench. It stayed there until the rain ruined it. I started writing again, quietly. Recipes, food memories, fragments of stories. I kept a notebook beside my bed and another in the kitchen drawer. It helped me feel real again, like I hadn't disappeared entirely. Every so often, I'd overhear conversations through the thin walls about groceries, soccer schedules, holiday plans. My name was rarely mentioned. When it was as a logistical detail, like the mailbox or the garbage bins. One Sunday morning, I offered to take the kids to the park while Sandra cleaned the house. She hesitated before saying yes, as though calculating whether I could handle it. When I returned, she checked their backpacks, their hands, even their shoes, before thanking me. It wasn't unkind, just clinical. Like I was a substitute she hadn't asked for, but couldn't yet replace. Thanksgiving was approaching, and the conversation came up over dinner. I was there, but not quite part of the discussion. Sandra mentioned a new restaurant that offered full-service holiday meals. She said it would be modern, professional, a fresh take on the old classics. Matthew agreed, distracted, scrolling through his phone. I waited for someone to ask me what I thought. No one did. Later that night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. I remembered the first Thanksgiving I hosted after my mother died. I had been 27. The turkey had come out dry, the cranberry sauce too sweet. But my father had said, "It tastes like effort, and that's what matters." Now, effort didn't seem to matter at all. Only appearances, presentation, convenience. I wasn't asked to cook that year. I wasn't even asked if I wanted to help. The decision was already made. The invitation to join the family had been given, but not the invitation to belong. And yet, deep inside, something small and firm remained, like the core of a fruit, bitter but strong. I didn't know then what it would grow into, only that I was not finished yet. I always believed that kindness should be offered freely, not managed like a schedule or rationed like sugar during wartime. But in that house, kindness had rules. It had a time slot. It had to fit neatly between meetings, soccer games, and Sandra's color-coded calendar that hung on the fridge. I learned quickly that my attempts to help weren't seen as helpful. They were viewed as interruptions. Still, I tried. That was my nature. I didn't know how not to. At first, it was small things. Folding laundry that had been left in the dryer, unloading the dishwasher, straightening up the shoes by the front door. I never announced it. I didn't do it for praise. I did it because the silence in my suite was too loud, and I wanted to feel useful. The reaction was always the same: a tight smile, a pause too long, then a comment that felt like it had been tested in Sandra's mind before release. "Oh, thanks, but next time, just leave it. We have our own way." Their own way. That phrase followed me like the scent of lemon cleaner. Familiar, sterile, unmistakably not mine. Their way was delivery apps, digital grocery lists, planned meals in plastic containers labeled Monday through Friday. Their way was efficiency. My way was simmering, slow baking, ingredients touched by hand and memory. I once made soup, just a simple chicken broth with vegetables, the kind I used to bring to my students during finals week. I left it on the stove with a note. When I came back, it had been poured down the drain. Sandra said it had gone lukewarm and weird. I stopped leaving food in the kitchen. Instead, I started collecting small moments, observations, glances between them, whispers that stopped when I entered a room. I noticed how Sandra rolled her eyes when I asked about the kids' school projects, how Matthew winced when I brought up memories of his childhood. It wasn't overt cruelty. It was dismissal, quiet, consistent, sharp as vinegar. I wasn't included in the inside jokes. I was background filler, a warm body in a cold house. There was one day I'll never forget, a Friday before the long weekend. Sandra had forgotten to buy snacks for the kids' school event. She was frantic, muttering as she searched the pantry. I had been planning to make banana bread that morning, something simple to use up the overripe bananas on the counter. Instead, I offered to make cookies for the class. She hesitated, then nodded, as if she didn't fully trust me, but had no other choice. I baked quietly, measured everything by hand, no shortcuts. The smell filled the house: vanilla, cinnamon, brown sugar. It was a scent that once meant home. I placed the cookies in a box lined with parchment and tied it with twine. No decoration, just warmth. When I handed them to her, Sandra took them with a polite nod and walked out the door. That night, there was no mention of the cookies. 2 days later, I overheard her telling someone on the phone that the bakery had done a decent job on short notice. I stood in the hallway, out of sight, my hands trembling around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. She hadn't even tasted them. I was sure of that. She hadn't asked. That box could have come from anywhere, and to her, it had. I wanted to believe she didn't mean harm, that she was busy, distracted, tired. But the truth settled in my chest like flour dust in old lungs, soft, weightless, but inescapable. My presence was not a gift in this house. It was tolerated. My kindness wasn't appreciated. It was inspected, downgraded, and quietly discarded. One afternoon, I offered to babysit while Matthew and Sandra went out for dinner. They agreed with conditions, a list of what the kids could and couldn't eat, what shows were approved when they had to be in bed. I followed every instruction. When they came home, the kids were asleep, the dishes were washed, the living room tidy. Sandra thanked me with that same mechanical smile, but later that week she scheduled a nanny interview. I found the pamphlet in the recycling bin. I stopped offering after that. There was a rhythm in that house, and I wasn't part of it. I was a background hum they wanted to lower, not silence completely, just enough to stop noticing. So I learned to be quiet, not just in voice, but in presence. I became careful with the space I occupied. I took shorter showers. I walked softer. I bought my own groceries and labeled them. I waited for the kids to come to me, but they rarely did. Kindness on command is no longer kindness. It's performance. And I wasn't an actress. I had spent my life teaching people how to create something with their hands, their time, their care. But no one wanted that here. They wanted smooth edges, clean lines, no reminders of age, effort, or history. And least of all, no reminders of me. Still, I baked, not for them, for me, in small batches, quietly, when the house was empty or asleep. I kept the door closed and opened the window. I began leaving little tins of bread and cookies in random places, the library drop box, the church office, the firehouse desk. I didn't leave a name, but each time the tins disappeared. And that small act, unseen, unthanked, was the only kind of giving that still felt real. It started with laughter. Light, careless laughter echoing from the living room one afternoon while I was folding towels in the laundry room. The door wasn't closed all the way, so I heard every word more clearly than they probably intended. Sandra was on the phone, and her voice rose in that familiar tone people use when they think they're being clever. She was telling someone, maybe her sister, maybe a friend, that I had tried to teach the kids how to peel apples like it was 1952. The person on the other end burst out laughing, and Sandra joined in. She said I was sweet, in a dusty, encyclopedia kind of way. I didn't move, I didn't blink. I just stared at the white towel in my hands, its corners suddenly sharp. That was the first time I felt it for certain, the gap between how they acted around me and how they spoke about me. I had always sensed it, like a draft under a door you can't quite seal, but now I had heard it with my own ears. There was a difference between being ignored and being mocked. One stung, the other left a wound. After that, I started noticing more. The way Sandra would glance at her phone and smirk when I entered the room. How Matthew would avoid eye contact if I asked him something nostalgic, like where he kept the recipe book I'd given him when he moved out. I could tell they shared private jokes I wasn't part of, jokes that used me as the punchline. One afternoon, I opened the family laptop to search for an online coupon. A tab was still open, half covered by another window. It was a group chat, casual and messy, filled with emojis and quick comments. A conversation among Sandra and her friends. My name appeared in it, Imael. I scrolled back a little, just enough to see the context. One message said, "She's harmless, but it's like living with a Victorian ghost." Another, "Waited for me to compliment her soup. I gave it to the dog." I closed the laptop slowly, gently, as if slamming it might confirm how much I had seen. I didn't mention it to anyone. What could I say? That I had stumbled into a room I wasn't meant to see? That I had read my own obituary, written in sarcasm? They hadn't lied, not exactly, but the things they said had peeled something off of me. A layer of belief, of hope, of the illusion that I was still welcome. There were other moments, more subtle, but just as cutting. Once I found a photo of myself in the trash. It had been taken during a summer barbecue years ago. I remembered that day. I had worn a red apron and grilled chicken while the kids played with water balloons. In the picture, I was smiling, mid-laugh. Someone had written across it in blue marker, "Classic," and someone else had scribbled underneath, "Expired." It felt like vandalism, but with pens instead of hammers. I began to doubt my instincts. Was I too sensitive? Was this just humor I didn't understand? But humor doesn't leave you feeling hollow. It doesn't make you watch your own reflection for signs of irrelevance. I stopped wearing my favorite earrings, stopped humming while I cooked. I became careful about everything: how I sat, how I spoke, how I dressed. I didn't want to give them more material. I noticed changes in the children too. The oldest, Emma, used to run into my suite without knocking, asking to help me bake or braid my hair. Now she knocked first, and sometimes not at all. The younger one, Jonah, once told me his mom said my food smells weird. He didn't mean to hurt me. He said it the way children say everything, plainly, like naming the weather. Still, it cut deeper than any adult's insult. Eventually, I started staying in my suite more. I took longer walks. I spent afternoons in the library reading cookbooks I'd read a dozen times already, not for recipes, but for comfort. The pages were soft, their margins scribbled with notes from years when people valued what I had to say. I remembered the pride in my students' faces when they mastered bechamel or kneaded dough until it sighed. No one mocked me there. No one rolled their eyes. I told myself I was being mature by not confronting them. That silence was dignity. But in truth, I stayed silent because I knew how that conversation would go. They'd deny it. They'd call it a misunderstanding. They'd say I was overreacting. And worse, they might laugh again. One night, while brushing my hair before bed, I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because I had aged, but because I had shrunk, not in size, but in spirit. I had bent myself around their comfort for so long that I no longer stood straight. I had let myself become something to be tolerated instead of someone to be respected. It wasn't just behind my back. It was right in front of me, in the polite nods, the orchestrated kindness, the carefully worded dismissals. But what they never realized was that I had ears sharper than they thought, a memory longer than they assumed, and hands that still knew how to create something lasting. They saw me as a shadow, but they forgot. Shadows come from light. Thanksgiving was approaching, and the calendar on the fridge filled up with appointments, deliveries, and reservations. Sandra had written everything in her precise handwriting, using different colors for each category: green for school, blue for work, red for home events. My name was nowhere on that calendar. I wasn't surprised, but it still settled somewhere in my chest like a heavy stone that refused to move. They began to plan the holiday 2 weeks in advance. I heard bits and pieces, menu discussions, talk of decor, seating arrangements, the name of a restaurant that apparently offered curated gourmet Thanksgiving boxes. It was all very polished, very modern, very not me. They didn't ask what I thought, didn't ask if I had a favorite dish or tradition. It was as if I were a houseplant, present, quiet, watered occasionally, but never consulted. One afternoon, Sandra came back from a tasting event for the catering service and spoke excitedly to Matthew in the kitchen. I stood in the hallway folding a blanket, pretending not to listen. She said the stuffing was next level. The turkey was sous vide perfection, and the cranberry sauce had a subtle star anise infusion. I had been making cranberry sauce from scratch for 40 years, but I'd never once infused it with star anise. I knew better than to comment. My recipes weren't welcome. My presence was tolerated. My expertise ignored. The invitations went out digitally, and I saw the guest list printed accidentally on a sheet of paper left on the printer. There were names I recognized from their country club, co-workers, even Sandra's old college roommate. Next to each guest was a note about dietary restrictions, favorite drinks, conversation topics. Next to my name, in a different ink, was a small comment in parentheses. Keep her near the kitchen. It wasn't meant for me to see, but I did, and I felt the blood rise to my face in a slow, creeping wave, not out of anger, but out of something worse, confirmation. I wasn't just excluded from the meal preparation, I was being managed, positioned, like a piece of decor that didn't match the theme, but couldn't quite be removed. The day before Thanksgiving, Sandra took over the entire kitchen. Grocery bags arrived, labeled with tags from the restaurant, boxes of pre-prepared components, sauces, garnishes. She laid them out like a stylist preparing for a magazine shoot. I offered to help once, quietly, carefully. She smiled without looking at me and said everything was under control. I nodded and left the room. That night, as I sat alone in my suite, I thought about the Thanksgivings I had hosted over the years. The chaos, the smells, the burned rolls, the laughter, the long meals where stories stretched between courses. This wasn't a meal, it was a product. It had been focus grouped and branded and scheduled. There was no room for accidents or traditions, or the woman who once taught a generation how to brine a bird without drying it out. The morning of Thanksgiving arrived with a strange silence. The house felt sterile, as if joy had been packed away with the plastic containers. I dressed carefully, nothing fancy, but respectable. A navy blue sweater and slacks, simple earrings, a touch of perfume. I brushed my hair until it lay flat and steady. I wanted to look like someone who belonged. When guests arrived, the doorbell rang in polite intervals. The children were dressed in matching clothes. Sandra wore a cream blouse and tailored pants. Matthew hovered, anxious, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. No one introduced me. I stood near the edge of the entryway, smiling softly, trying to find a role. Eventually, Sandra gestured toward the kitchen table, the one tucked just to the side, not far from the swinging door that led to the pantry. "This is perfect for you," she said, still smiling, her voice light, practiced, rehearsed. It was a card table covered with a linen cloth, set for one. The plates matched the rest of the service, but there was no centerpiece, no candle, no space to speak. The main dining room table stretched across the open floor plan, full of crystal glasses and carefully placed name cards. I stood there, feeling like a mannequin in the wrong window. No one protested. No one said, "Why isn't she with us?" They just sat, ate, laughed. Occasionally, someone turned to ask me to pass something through the door. They praised the stuffing, the turkey, the presentation. I nodded. I smiled. I said nothing. At one point, a guest walked into the kitchen to get more wine and glanced at me with that polite discomfort people reserve for the elderly or the slightly out of place. She said it must be so relaxing to not have to cook anymore. I smiled again. My jaw hurt from smiling. I ate alone. I chewed slowly, not because I wanted to savor the food, but because the silence around me felt too fast, too hollow. I could hear every clink of their forks, every pop of laughter, every moment I was not part of. Shame didn't hit me like a slap. It arrived like a slow wind, pulling at the corners of my dignity until I had to grip it with both hands just to keep it from blowing away. After dinner, I gathered the used plates from my own small table and rinsed them in the sink. No one asked me to. No one noticed. I was a quiet shadow, a figure at the edge of the frame. I didn't cry. I didn't slam doors. I just washed the dishes, dried them, and put them away. That evening, I went back to my suite and sat at the small desk by the window. Outside, the wind had picked up. Leaves skittered across the lawn like they had someplace to be. I looked at my hands, strong hands, capable hands, and felt something shift. Not rage, not sadness, something colder, quieter, a kind of clarity that only comes when humiliation is complete and there is nothing left to lose. After Thanksgiving, something inside me turned still. It wasn't numbness, not exactly. It was something quieter, more deliberate, a kind of watching. I stopped offering. I stopped asking. I stopped putting myself in places I was not wanted. Instead, I watched. Closely, patiently. The way I used to observe my students when they were about to make a mistake in the kitchen, not to stop them, but to let them learn from the fire or the spill. Some things I had learned long ago only reveal themselves when no one is looking for them. I began taking long walks through town, slipping into bakeries and cafes, looking not for food, but for details. I'd sit in a corner with a notebook and watch how people behaved when they thought they were unseen. I noticed which cafes labeled their pastries with names like Grandma's Butter Crust or Nana's Apple Bars. Nostalgia was a currency now. It sold. And the irony of it didn't escape me. The same traditions that had been mocked in one house were being monetized in another. One morning, I passed a newly opened restaurant downtown, Maison Aube. The lettering on the window was elegant, almost too refined for the block. I recognized the name. It was French for House of Dawn. I remembered the young man who had taken my class over a decade ago. His name was Caleb Avery, awkward, soft-spoken, always arriving early with flour on his sleeves. He had been one of the few who listened, truly listened, when I explained the weight of ingredients, the pause before a simmer, the sacredness of bread rising in a silent kitchen. I wasn't sure it was his place, but the name, the font, the menu, it all felt like him. The next day, I called the restaurant. I didn't ask for Caleb. I asked to speak with the head chef. The woman who answered paused, then said, "Just a moment." A familiar voice came on the line. He didn't recognize me at first, but when I said, "I taught you how to temper eggs without breaking the yolk," he laughed, a real unguarded laugh. Then he said, "Miss Joyce?" We spoke for 20 minutes. I didn't tell him everything, just that I was nearby, that I'd seen his restaurant, that I was proud. He asked if I'd stop by. I said I would. When I visited the restaurant that week, he came out from the kitchen wearing a crisp apron and a humble smile. He led me through the back, past the prep stations, the quiet hum of refrigeration units, the lined-up knives and trays. It smelled like purpose, like a place where things mattered. He brought out a small tasting plate, a slice of rosemary cornbread, a delicate spoon of cranberry compote, and a square of pecan tart with sea salt. I recognized them. They were mine, not copied, but inspired, refined versions of the recipes I had shared in class. He said, "I've always credited my foundations to you." I didn't speak. I just nodded, tasting the echo of a past that had somehow survived. I told him I wasn't looking for work, that I didn't need money or attention, but that I had ideas, traditions. He listened carefully. Then he said something that stayed with me. He said, "People don't want new. They want what feels like home, but made with care." He asked if I'd be willing to consult on a special holiday set for the upcoming Christmas menu. Not officially. just help craft something authentic? I said yes. In the evenings, back in the quiet of my suite, I drafted recipes by hand. I wrote notes in the margins, things like "don't oversalt the past" and "let butter speak first." I treated it like a sacred task, not because of revenge or pride or some petty need to be seen, but because it reminded me that I hadn't disappeared. I still knew things. My hands still remembered. Meanwhile, I kept watching at home. I observed the rhythms of the household, the way Sandra bragged about convenience, about imported truffle oils and meal kits. I listened to Matthew repeat phrases he never used to say, parroting someone else's opinions about food as efficiency. I noticed the children reaching for boxed snacks with barely a glance at the fruit bowl. They didn't ask what I did with my days, and I didn't tell them, but I began getting up earlier. I wrote while the sun rose, sifting through memories and measuring out proportions. I kept my notes in an old recipe binder, one that used to hold my lesson plans. Its pages were yellowed, but I slid new paper into the plastic sleeves, clean, fresh, full of quiet intention. I met with Caleb 3 more times over the next few weeks. We shaped the holiday menu together. Winter Pantry Set, we called it. It featured roasted root vegetables, cornbread with honey butter, spiced apple preserves, and a small pecan pie with a handwritten card inside. Recipe passed down, flavor carried forward. He asked if he could use my name on the menu, not in big letters, just at the bottom, under a line that read, "Inspired by M. Joyce, my first teacher." I said he could. The idea of it made something inside me unfold, a part of myself I thought I had folded away for good, not because I wanted recognition, but because it was a way of leaving something behind that mattered, something no one could mock, reposition, or erase. I still ate dinner alone most nights. I still walked past conversations I wasn't invited into, but I no longer felt like I was shrinking. I no longer felt like I was hiding. I wasn't gone. I was simply observing, absorbing, preparing, not with bitterness, with precision. They thought I was silent because I was weak. They mistook my stillness for surrender. But I was learning, watching, measuring the temperature of the room like I would a delicate custard, waiting for just the right moment to turn up the heat. The house was quiet in the way that only December houses can be, dim with early darkness, settled under the soft pressure of cold weather and obligation. A storm had passed through earlier that day, just rain, but the wind had left the trees bare and the roads slick. Inside, everything was tidy and staged, ready for the next day's holiday gathering. Sandra had spent the afternoon arranging decorations she'd ordered online: metallic wreaths, LED candles, neutral-toned garlands with no trace of childhood or tradition. She moved through the rooms with her phone in one hand and a glass of wine in the other, orchestrating perfection. I stayed in my suite for most of the day, preparing in silence. Not cleaning or cooking, not organizing drawers or writing in my notebook. I prepared with thought, with careful mental steps, like lining up mise en place before a meal that matters. Everything had already been done in the days before, the menu finalized, the packages arranged, the last confirmation from Caleb sent. I didn't need to do anything more, but I couldn't rest either. That evening, after they'd all gone to bed, I stepped out into the kitchen, barefoot. The tiles were cold, grounding. I didn't turn on the overhead lights, just the small one over the stove, the one that cast a quiet circle of yellow onto the counter. The catering boxes had arrived earlier and sat stacked in the fridge, sealed, labeled, precise. Sandra had double-checked the inventory with military focus, comparing notes on her tablet. She hadn't noticed the subtle change. The box marked Dessert Course Set A was not the one she expected. Caleb had arranged it with care. The special set, the real set, had been delivered under a different name and switched with the identical outer packaging. It looked exactly the same from the outside, same sticker, same label, but the contents were mine, ours, crafted over weeks, shaped from memory and muscle, built from the quiet collaboration between a forgotten teacher and a once eager student. Inside the dessert box were 4 items: my pecan tart with flaked salt, a square of spice cake soaked in orange glaze, cinnamon roasted walnuts in a mason jar with a hand-tied ribbon, and a folded card. On the card was a message printed in the restaurant's formal typeface. This dessert course is part of the Maison Aube Heritage Series, designed in collaboration with Monsieur Joyce, who taught our head chef how to taste with memory. All recipes are hers. We thank her for teaching us that food is a form of love passed through generations. I ran my fingers over the card and then placed it back inside the box, folding the lid down slowly, as if sealing a secret. I placed the box at the front of the stack, where it would be the first one Sandra opened. It was not revenge. It was revelation. Back in my suite, I pulled out the recipe binder one last time. I didn't open it. I just sat with it on my lap, like an old friend who no longer needed to speak to be understood. I thought about all the students I'd taught over the years, about the ones who never made it past boiling water, and the ones who went on to build kitchens of their own. I thought about the first time I'd made that pecan tart for a holiday potluck when Matthew was 8. He'd eaten 3 slices, said it tasted like magic and sugar. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who rarely looked me in the eye and used words like optimization when talking about dinner. But I still remembered the boy. I cooked for him, not for the man who forgot how to ask about my day. Outside, the wind picked up again, sweeping leaves down the empty street. I closed the curtains and dimmed the lamp. I didn't expect a confrontation tomorrow. Sandra would be caught off guard but too proud to admit it. She would smile and serve the desserts without reading the card. But someone would. Someone always reads the card. There's a moment in every kitchen just before the meal is served when the cook steps back and takes a breath. The air changes. The food is no longer just food. It becomes memory, offering, legacy. Tomorrow, I would sit quietly at that table and watch people taste a piece of my past without knowing it. I would see them pause, maybe close their eyes, maybe smile without understanding why. And that would be enough. I turned off the light and lay down, hands folded over my stomach like a woman at peace. I didn't need credit. I didn't need applause. I needed only to reclaim the part of myself they had tried to shrink, not with volume, but with presence, not with confrontation, but with craft. I had watched them for months, and now they would taste everything I'd learned. The morning arrived slowly, dragging with it the crisp stillness of winter and the low hum of expectation that always hangs in the air before guests arrive. The house smelled faintly of citrus and pine from the candles Sandra had set out. Everything looked like it had been curated for a magazine spread: minimalist wreaths, white linen napkins, gold-rimmed glasses. The table was flawless, sterile even. I stayed in my suite longer than usual, listening to the rhythm of the house, the sound of vacuuming upstairs, the murmur of Sandra giving instructions, the clink of china being moved into position. I made tea and drank it slowly, watching the steam rise in delicate spirals. There was no rush. Everything that needed to happen was already in motion. Guests began to arrive just before noon. I could hear their coats being taken, compliments exchanged at the door. Laughter, loud and performative, filled the entryway. The living room swelled with voices. From my seat by the window, I could see the shimmer of sequins on someone's dress, the glint of cufflinks, the polished shoes moving across hardwood. I waited. At some point, Sandra called for me. Her tone was bright, but a touch too loud. I stepped out and walked into the dining room. The table was full. I had no designated seat. There was an extra chair placed against the wall at the far end, as though it had been added as an afterthought. I took it without comment. Dinner moved forward with the rehearsed ease of an event, not a gathering. Dishes were unboxed from pristine containers, arranged on porcelain trays, and passed around with choreographed precision. Everyone praised the presentation, the flavors, the modern twist. I ate quietly, chewing each bite slowly, not for the taste, but for the silence it bought me. Then dessert came. Sandra opened the box, reading the label as she lifted the lid. Her hands froze for a fraction of a second. Not long, just enough for me to see it, enough to catch the flicker of confusion, then recognition. The card had slipped to the top, resting delicately on the plastic covering the pecan tart. She didn't say a word. She removed the card and placed it face down on the counter, as if it were irrelevant. She began plating the desserts, moving methodically. The guests clapped lightly at the presentation, complimenting the artisanal look, the nostalgic smell. One woman commented that it reminded her of her grandmother's holiday table. Another asked for the name of the pastry chef. Sandra smiled and said it was from a collaborative holiday set designed by Maison Aube. Someone eventually turned over the card. A man near the head of the table, reading glasses perched on his nose, held it up and read aloud the dedication at the bottom. Inspired by Mimsa Joyce, my first teacher. A pause. He looked around. Well, would you look at that? Eyes turned toward me. Curious, polite. I nodded gently. Someone asked if that was me. I said yes. Another guest raised their glass. To the teacher behind the taste. A toast followed. A polite, brief clinking of glasses. Sandra remained standing behind the dessert plates, her smile held in place like a mask. Matthew didn't speak. I watched them eat. I watched as they tasted something that had come from my hands, my memory, my years. And I watched as they didn't know what to say. Because what could they say? They had taken me out of the kitchen, out of the conversation, out of the tradition. But here I was, reintroduced by flavor, by texture, by the undeniable presence of legacy. After dessert, I stepped outside for air. The sky was a deep slate gray, the kind that holds snow but hasn't yet decided to let it fall. The air stung, but it woke me up. I stood on the porch and breathed in the cold until my lungs ached. When I came back inside, the house had quieted. Guests were gathering coats, saying goodbyes. The children were upstairs, giggling behind a closed door. I returned to my suite and sat down at my desk. There, in the drawer, was the binder. On top of it, I had placed a small envelope days before. Inside it was the agreement Caleb and I had signed, a quiet contract allowing the restaurant to release a line of desserts under my name. A modest royalty, nothing extravagant, but more than enough. Next to the envelope was a single brass key, the key to the test kitchen he had given me access to, should I ever want to teach again, or bake, or create. He had said it with no pressure. Just in case, he told me. I turned the key over in my hand, feeling its weight. It wasn't heavy, but it felt solid, real, like something earned. I wasn't going to announce anything, not tonight, not to them, but I knew, as surely as I knew how long to chill a tart crust before baking, that something had shifted. This wasn't about reclaiming my place at their table. I no longer wanted it. It was about reclaiming something else entirely, my craft, my voice, my dignity. They had served my past in silence. Now I would walk into my future with the key in my hand. The holidays ended, and with them went the artificial warmth that had filled the house. The garlands were packed away, the lights taken down, the table settings boxed and returned to storage. The silence that followed was familiar, but it no longer hurt. It was not the silence of exile. It was the silence of clarity. In the days after the dinner, no one spoke of the card or the dessert, or the name that had lingered on the lips of the guests like the aftertaste of cinnamon. Sandra avoided eye contact. Matthew acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Life resumed its stiff rhythm, and I let it. I had no intention of confronting anyone, not because I was afraid, but because I had finally realized that confrontation wouldn't give me what I wanted. I didn't want apologies. I wanted freedom. And I already had it. I spent my mornings in the kitchen of Maison Aub's test space. Caleb gave me a passcode and a drawer labeled MJ. I filled it slowly, first with notes and spice jars, then with the first ingredients for what would become a new menu line. We called it inheritance. It wasn't about legacy in the traditional sense. It was about passing down something deeper than blood, a flavor, a moment, a kind of knowing. The kitchen was mine again, not in title, but in spirit. It smelled of roasted sugar and citrus peel, of warm flour and browned butter, the kind of scent that can pull someone back 10 years in a single breath. I spent hours experimenting, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. There was no judgment in that space, no whispers, no mockery, just the quiet hum of the ovens and the confidence of a woman who had survived dismissal and come out stronger. Back at the house, my presence became increasingly invisible. I came and went as I pleased. No one asked where I'd been. No one noticed the late nights or early mornings. That suited me fine. I no longer felt bound to their timelines or expectations. I wasn't the extra chair at their table anymore. I was the architect of my own. One afternoon, I returned home to find the house empty. A note sat on the counter in Sandra's handwriting. Took the kids to visit Mom for a few days. Matt's flying out tomorrow, back next week. There was no mention of me, no inquiry about whether I needed anything, whether I would be all right. I stared at the note for a long time, not because it shocked me, but because of how unsurprising it was. They had left, without asking, again. This time, I didn't cry. I didn't pace or stew or rehearse imaginary arguments in my head. I simply walked upstairs, opened the hall closet, and began to pack. Not out of anger, out of certainty. I didn't take everything, just what mattered. My recipe binders, a few books, the blue sweater I always wore when baking, a small ceramic dish I'd made in a pottery class years ago that held my sea salt. I packed neatly, deliberately, like someone preparing for something, not escaping it. By the time they returned, the suite was clean. The bed made, the drawers empty. On the small kitchen table, I left a sealed envelope. Inside was a short note, not spiteful, not emotional, just a statement of fact. I've moved. I'm fine. Please don't worry. Underneath, I taped a clipping from a local magazine that had just been published. An article titled, "The Woman Behind the Warmth: How One Retired Teacher is Reshaping Holiday Desserts." My picture was there, not a glamorous one, just me in an apron, smiling softly, holding a pie with both hands like a prayer. I rented a small apartment above a flower shop in town. It had creaky floors and crooked cabinets, but the oven worked, and the light from the kitchen window hit the counter just right in the afternoons. I filled the space slowly. Old things, new plants, a wooden clock that ticked audibly and reminded me that time still passed on my terms now. In the weeks that followed, I received cards from people who had been at that holiday dinner, from former students, even from strangers who had tried my recipes through the restaurant and wanted to tell me what it reminded them of. A grandfather's orchard, a mother's kitchen, a childhood morning. Not once did I hear from Sandra. Matthew sent one text that read, "Hope you're okay." I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. They had left me too many times before, but this time I had left first, not physically, but in all the ways that mattered. I thought about the key often. the literal one to the restaurant, and the metaphorical one I had always held but forgotten I possessed. The key to walking away, the key to choosing dignity over duty, the key to knowing that you do not have to accept every invitation simply because it's offered in the name of family. For a long time, I had believed that love meant staying, that forgiveness meant silence, that respect had to be earned over and over, regardless of how often it was denied in return. But I had unlearned that, slowly, painfully, permanently. Now, no one would leave without asking. Not from my table, not from my heart, not from my life. Because I no longer lived in their house, I lived in mine.